Elena Whitmore's hand froze on the door handle when she heard a woman's voice inside the room that was not supposed to exist. She had been Queen of Aldermere for 5 years, and in 5 years, she had never once set foot in this narrow hallway on the far side of the West Wing. She had only found it tonight because a missing ledger had sent her searching through rooms she rarely visited, and a servant girl named Clara had gone pale and refused to say what lay behind the last door on the left. Now Elena stood in front of that door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could be heard through the wood. The voice inside was soft, almost happy, talking to someone about names for a baby. Then a second voice answered, low and careful, a voice Elena knew better than her own breath. It belonged to her husband, King Alexander Thorne. She did not open the door. She could not make her hand move. Instead, she stepped back, pressed herself against the cold stone wall, and listened as the King of Aldermere spoke gently to a woman who was clearly not his wife, about children who were clearly not Elena's. For a long moment, the whole castle seemed to stop breathing with her. Elena had grown up in a smaller kingdom to the north, the daughter of a minor lord, and she had never expected to become queen of anything. Her marriage to Alexander had been arranged when she was 20, a political match meant to secure peace between two old rival houses. She remembered the wedding as a blur of white silk and formal smiles, two strangers standing before a crowd and promising forever to each other. What she had not expected was to fall in love with him. It had happened slowly, in the way real things often do. She noticed it first in small moments, the way he listened when she spoke about her ideas for the kingdom's schools, the way he remembered the names of every servant's children, the way he would sit with her in comfortable silence after long council meetings, too tired for words but not wanting to be apart. Over time, the arranged marriage had become something she treasured. She believed he treasured it too. There had been sadness between them, one sadness in particular. In 5 years of marriage, Elena had not been able to give the kingdom an heir. She had seen physicians from 3 different kingdoms, had followed every remedy offered to her, had prayed in every temple in the capital. Nothing had worked. She had cried about it more nights than she could count, always in private, never wanting Alexander to see how much it hurt her. He had always told her it did not matter to him, that he loved her regardless of what the physicians said. Standing in that hallway now, listening to a stranger's voice speaking about a baby that was clearly his, Elena understood that his words might have been kind lies. She walked back to her chambers that night, without saying a word to anyone. Clara tried to ask if she was well, and Elena managed a small smile, and said she was only tired. She undressed alone, lay in the enormous bed she shared with her husband, and stared at the ceiling, until the sky outside her window turned from black to gray. She did not sleep. She planned. The next morning she told no one what she had heard. She went about her usual duties, meeting with the head of the treasury, reviewing requests from 3 villages asking for repairs to their roads, listening to a young noblewoman complain about her neighbor's fence. Elena smiled where smiles were expected, and nodded where nods were expected, and inside she felt as though a fire had been lit under everything she thought she knew about her life. She needed proof. Not because she doubted what she had heard, the voices had been unmistakable, but because she needed to understand the shape of what she was dealing with before she decided what to do about it. A queen does not act on rumor, even a rumor she has heard with her own ears. A queen gathers facts. So she began to watch. She noticed things she had somehow missed before, or had chosen not to see. Alexander's absences on nights when he claimed to be reviewing border reports with his most trusted advisor, a sharp-eyed nobleman named Edmund Castellan. The way certain guards would straighten and grow quiet whenever she walked near the West Wing. The fact that a healer named Margaret, who Elena had always assumed worked exclusively for the royal nursery preparations that never came, was seen slipping in and out of that same hallway at strange hours. 3 days after she first heard the voice through the door, Elena decided she needed to see the truth with her own eyes, not just hear it through wood and stone. She thought carefully about how to do this without drawing attention. A queen wandering the West Wing at night would be noticed immediately and reported to her husband before she took 10 steps. She needed to become someone else, if only for an hour. There was an old gray cloak in the back of her wardrobe, one she had worn years ago, on a trip to visit sick villagers outside the capital, before she had become too recognizable to move freely through her own kingdom. She found it, along with a plain dress that had once belonged to a lady's maid who had left her service. She wrapped her hair beneath a simple scarf, the way the healers and midwives did when they traveled between houses, and studied herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the tired, plain woman looking back at her. Good. That was exactly what she needed. That night, when Alexander told her he had urgent matters to attend to and would be delayed in returning to their chambers, Elena waited until the castle had gone quiet. Then she slipped out through a servant's passage she had learned about years ago from an old cook who had since passed away, and made her way toward the west wing. Her heart hammered the entire way. Every echo of a footstep made her freeze against the nearest wall. Every distant voice made her breath catch in her throat. She was queen of this castle, and yet she had never felt more like an intruder within its walls. When she reached the narrow hallway, she found the door slightly open, a soft light spilling out from within. She approached slowly, staying low, and looked through the gap. The room inside was warm and comfortable, far more so than Elena had expected for a hidden corner of the castle. There was a fire burning in a small hearth, fine furniture, tapestries on the walls. And there, resting in a cushioned chair near the fire, sat a young woman with dark hair and a round, heavily pregnant belly, one hand resting gently on top of it. The woman was beautiful in a soft, quiet way, nothing like the fierce court ladies Elena had grown used to. She looked tired, but content, the way a person looks when they believe their future is secure. Elena had come prepared to feel angry. What she felt instead, in that first moment, was something closer to grief. This woman was carrying a child, possibly more than one, judging by the size of her. A child that Alexander wanted, apparently, badly enough to hide it from his own wife. Elena pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. She stayed at that door for only a few minutes, but in that time, she learned enough to understand the shape of her new reality. She heard the woman, whose name she would later learn was Marisol Hale, speaking quietly to Margaret the healer, about how many months remained, about how careful they needed to be, about how everything would change once the children were born, and the king could finally announce them to the kingdom. The word children, not child. Elena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and made her way back through the servants' passage, moving faster now, no longer caring quite so much about the noise of her own footsteps. By the time she reached her chambers, her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly remove the borrowed cloak. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at nothing. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of believing that the sadness they shared over her inability to conceive was a burden they carried together, and this entire time, apparently, there had been another woman, tucked away behind a door in the west wing, carrying what the healer had called the future of the kingdom. Elena thought about confronting Alexander immediately. She imagined marching into his study, throwing open the door, demanding an explanation in front of whoever happened to be present. She imagined the shock on his face, the scramble for excuses, the inevitable arguments about duty and kingdoms, and the desperate need for heirs. But something held her back, a quiet, careful part of her mind, the same part that had made her wait 3 days before investigating instead of confronting him the very night she first heard the voices, told her that she still did not have the whole picture. She had seen the woman, she had heard the word children, but she did not yet understand how this arrangement had come to be, who had approved it, and how long it had been planned. She decided to wait a little longer, to watch a little more. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, sitting there with her heart broken in her chest, choosing patience over the explosion of anger that wanted so badly to escape her. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet blur. Elena continued her royal duties as though nothing had changed, smiling at council meetings, greeting visiting dignitaries, walking the gardens with her ladies as though her entire understanding of her marriage had not just been shattered into pieces. She became an expert at hiding what she felt, a skill she had never wanted to need. At night, when Alexander returned to their shared chambers, she studied him in ways she never had before. She noticed the tiredness around his eyes that she had once attributed to the pressures of ruling a kingdom, and now wondered how much of it came from managing two separate lives. She noticed how, some nights, he would reach for her hand and hold it with what seemed like genuine tenderness, and she found herself wondering whether that tenderness was real or simply another kindness offered out of guilt. She began to understand that the woman she had seen was not, perhaps, the villain of this story. Marisol Hale had looked young and tired and entirely unaware that she was being watched through a cracked door by the wife of the man she loved. Whatever arrangement had brought her to that hidden room, it was possible she believed herself to be doing nothing wrong, believed perhaps that the Queen already knew, or that some other explanation made her presence acceptable. If there was a villain in this story, Elena suspected it was not so simple as one single person. One evening, nearly a week after her discovery, Elena found herself standing outside Alexander's private study, about to knock, when she heard him speaking inside with Edmund Castellan. She had meant to interrupt them to discuss an unrelated matter about the coming harvest festival, but something in the tone of their conversation made her pause with her hand raised in the air, not quite touching the door. She heard her own name. Slowly, carefully, she lowered her hand and leaned closer to listen, feeling a strange mix of shame and desperate need to know. Whatever she was about to hear, she understood it would change everything again. The voices inside were low, urgent, the kind of conversation men have when they believe themselves entirely alone. Elena closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, and listened with everything she had. Edmund Castellan's voice was steady, the voice of a man used to controlling every room he entered. The physicians were clear 5 years ago, he said. The Queen cannot give you what the kingdom needs. You waited long enough out of loyalty to her. No one can say you acted rashly. Elena's fingers curled against the doorframe. She had never heard those words spoken so plainly before, not even in her worst private moments of doubt. I did not ask for this arrangement to become permanent, Alexander said, and there was something rough in his voice, something that sounded almost like regret. I agreed to it because you told me the council would move against the succession without an heir in place. I never agreed to keep it from her for a year. You agreed to whatever kept the throne secure, Castellan said. The Queen's feelings, while I understand they matter to you, cannot outweigh the stability of Aldermere. Once the children are born, we present it as a matter of state. She will understand, in time, that this was necessary. Elena felt something cold settle into her chest, replacing the earlier grief with something sharper. This was not a moment of weakness on her husband's part. This was not two people falling into an affair out of loneliness or temptation. This had been planned, discussed, arranged by men in this very room, treating her marriage and her heart as obstacles to be managed, rather than a life to be respected. She deserves to know, Alexander said quietly. I have let this go on too long already. Every day I do not tell her feels like another lie added to the pile. And what good would telling her do now? Castellan's voice sharpened. The children will be born within 2 months. If you tell her now, you risk her doing something rash before the succession is secure. Wait until after the birth. Then we manage the announcement together, carefully, in a way that protects the throne and protects her position as queen. There was a long silence. Elena pictured her husband on the other side of that door, sitting with his head in his hands, caught between what Castellan called necessary and what his own conscience clearly told him was wrong. 2 months, Alexander finally said, so quietly Elena almost missed it. After that, I tell her everything myself, in my own words, not through some careful announcement crafted by the council. As you wish, Castellan said, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely agree, or did not entirely intend to honor that promise. Elena stepped back from the door, as silently as she had approached it, her mind working faster than she could process. 2 months. He was planning to keep this secret from her for 2 more months, all while continuing to share her bed, continuing to hold her hand in the evenings, continuing to let her believe that their shared grief over her inability to conceive was a burden carried equally between them. She walked back to her chambers in a daze, the harvest festival matter she had meant to discuss entirely forgotten. When Clara asked if she needed anything, Elena simply shook her head and asked to be left alone for the evening. That night, lying beside Alexander in their bed, Elena felt him reach for her hand in the darkness, the same gentle gesture he had offered 100 times before. She let him take it, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a man could hold her hand so tenderly while keeping something so enormous hidden behind a locked door down the hall. She did not sleep that night either. Over the following days, Elena's understanding of her situation continued to sharpen. She began quietly asking careful questions of people she trusted, phrasing everything so as not to arouse suspicion. She learned from an old steward, a man who had served the royal family for 30 years and who trusted the queen more than he trusted the current council, that Lady Marisol Hale had arrived at the castle nearly 10 months earlier, brought in under the guise of a distant cousin of Lord Castellan's, given quarters and privacy that seemed excessive for a mere relative. She learned that Margaret the healer had been reassigned from her usual duties in the village clinic nearly a year ago, moved to full-time residence within the castle. Her absence from the clinic explained to the villagers as a temporary arrangement that had somehow stretched on and on. Piece by piece, Elena assembled the picture of a plan that had been built carefully, deliberately, over the better part of a year, while she continued to believe her marriage was built on honesty. She thought about her own family, about the letters she occasionally received from her mother in the north, about the life she had left behind to come rule at Alexander's side. She thought about the years of physicians and remedies and prayers, about how much of herself she had poured into trying to give her husband the child he needed, never once suspecting that he had quietly begun looking elsewhere while she exhausted every option available to her. The anger, when it finally came, arrived not as a burst of fire, but as something colder and more permanent, settling into her bones like frost. She began, without fully realizing it at first, to plan her departure. It was not a decision made in a single moment. It grew slowly, the way the discovery of the truth had grown, piece by careful piece. She could not stay in a castle where her husband continued to smile at her over dinner, while a woman down the hall carried children he had chosen to keep secret from her. She could not continue pretending that nothing had changed, playing the role of loving wife, while inside she felt as though something essential had been carved out of her. But leaving a queen's life was not a simple matter. She could not simply walk out the front gate. She would need money that could not be traced easily to the royal treasury. She would need a plan for where to go, a new identity that would allow her to disappear from a kingdom where her face was known on coins and in portraits hung in every noble house. She began, quietly and carefully, to prepare. She sold, through a trusted merchant who had no connection to the court, several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her personally rather than to the crown, gifts from her own family rather than royal treasures that would be missed. She arranged, through the same old steward who had told her about Marisol's arrival, to have a small amount of coins set aside in a location outside the castle, explained away as charitable donations to a village in need. She thought carefully about where she might go, somewhere far enough from the capital that her face would not be immediately recognized, somewhere she could build a quiet life while she decided what came next. She thought of a coastal town she had visited once as a young girl, before her marriage, a place called Brenmore, where the streets smelled of salt and fish, and nobody had ever cared much about the doings of the royal family in the distant capital. Throughout all of this planning, she continued to watch Alexander, continued to share meals and conversations, and even affection with him, all the while carrying the enormous weight of what she knew and what she intended to do. It was, she thought sometimes in her quietest moments, the hardest performance of her life. One evening, about 10 days after she had overheard the conversation between Alexander and Castellan, Elena found herself standing at her window, looking out over the dark gardens below, when Alexander came to stand beside her. "You have seemed distant lately," he said, his voice gentle, concerned in a way that once would have warmed her but now only made her chest ache with the unfairness of it all. "Is something troubling you?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, this man she had loved so completely, who had built an entire secret life behind her back, while continuing to ask if something troubled her, as though he did not already know the answer better than anyone. "I am only tired," she said finally, the same lie she had told Clara that first night. "The season has been long." Alexander studied her face for a moment, and Elena thought, just for an instant, that he might finally say something honest, that the promise he had made to Castellan about telling her himself might arrive early, driven by whatever guilt still lived in him. Instead, he simply nodded, pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, and told her to rest well. He left the room to attend to some late evening business, and Elena stood alone at the window, watching his shadow disappear down the hallway, understanding with sudden clarity that she could not wait for him to find his courage. She would have to act on her own. That night, she finished the last of her preparations. She wrote no letter of explanation, left no note describing her reasons, because she understood that whatever she wrote would either be twisted by the council to make her look unstable, or would give Alexander a roadmap to find her before she was ready to be found. She simply removed her wedding ring, a heavy gold band set with a single sapphire that had once felt like the most precious thing she owned, and placed it gently on her pillow. Then, dressed once again in the plain gray cloak and simple dress she had worn to spy on Marisol's chambers, Elena Whitmore, Queen of Aldermere, slipped out of the castle through the same servants' passage she had used before, and disappeared into the night. The road out of the capital was darker than Elena remembered, and twice within the first hour she nearly turned back, her heart pounding at every sound of hooves in the distance, certain each one belonged to a royal guard sent to drag her back to a life she could no longer bear. She had planned her route carefully in the days before her departure, avoiding the main road that connected the capital to the coast, choosing instead a longer path through smaller villages where a lone traveler in a plain cloak would draw far less attention than she would on a road regularly patrolled by the king's men. She carried a small bag with what coin she had managed to set aside, a change of simple clothing, and a knife she had taken from the kitchens, more for the comfort of having it than any real belief she would need to use it. By the time the sun rose, she had reached a small village called Ashford, more than 15 miles from the castle. Her legs ached, her feet were blistered inside boots that were sturdy but unfamiliar, and exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She found an inn on the edge of the village, paid for a room with coins that felt strange in her hand after years of never having to think about money, and collapsed onto a narrow bed that felt harder than anything she had slept on in years. She did not sleep long. Fear kept pulling her back to wakefulness, imagining searchers already on her trail, imagining Alexander waking to find her ring on the pillow and immediately understanding what she had learned and where she might have gone. In truth, she had no way of knowing how much time she had before her absence was discovered, or how quickly the search might begin. She only knew she needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between herself and the capital as she could, before anyone realized she was truly gone, rather than simply resting in a private chamber somewhere within the castle. The journey to Brenmore took nearly 2 weeks, traveling mostly on foot, occasionally accepting rides from farmers heading toward the coast with carts of grain or wool. She told anyone who asked that her name was Nora, a widow traveling to live with a cousin by the sea, a story simple enough to be believed, and forgettable enough not to draw curiosity. She learned, during those 2 weeks, what it meant to be an ordinary woman in a kingdom she had ruled as queen. She learned how far a small amount of coin actually went when there was no treasury to draw from, how tiring physical labor could be when your body had spent years accustomed to soft beds and warm baths, how frightening the world could feel when you had no guards, no title, no name that commanded instant respect and protection. There were moments of genuine danger. Outside a village called Corin, she was nearly robbed by 2 men who followed her from a market stall, clearly having noticed the small pouch of coin she carried. She managed to escape by ducking into a crowded tavern and slipping out through a back door, while the men searched the front room, her heart racing so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She did not sleep that night, walking instead through darkness until she reached the safety of the next village. There were also moments of unexpected kindness. An elderly farmer named Walter, traveling with his cart toward the coast to sell wool, offered her a ride for 3 full days without asking many questions, sharing his food with her each evening, and telling stories about his grandchildren to pass the time. Elena found herself grateful for his company, in a way she had not expected, a simple human connection, unclouded by politics or titles, or the enormous weight of royal duty. By the time she reached the outskirts of Brenmore, the coastal town she remembered from her childhood, she was thinner, more tired, and in some strange way, more herself than she had felt in years. The town had grown since her last visit as a young girl, but it still carried the same salt air and the same sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore that she remembered. She found a small room to rent above a bakery run by a kind woman named Grace Hollins, who asked few questions about the tired traveler seeking lodging and simply offered a fair price and a warm meal on her first night. Elena, still using the name Nora, explained that she was a scribe by training, skilled in reading and writing, and hoping to find work in the town. Grace, it turned out, knew of a position. The town's shipping office needed someone to help manage records and correspondence, work that required careful handwriting and an understanding of numbers, both skills Elena possessed in abundance from years of managing royal accounts and correspondence. Within days, Elena found herself employed, sitting at a small desk in a cramped office near the harbor, recording the comings and goings of merchant ships instead of the comings and goings of foreign dignitaries. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of peace. The work was simple and honest. Her co-workers were friendly without being curious, the kind of people who accepted a quiet newcomer without demanding to know her whole history. The harbor master, a weathered man named Peter Ashby who ran the shipping office, treated her with respect and never once looked at her the way courtiers had always looked at their queen, with calculation hidden behind polite smiles. Each evening, after her work was finished, Elena would walk along the harbor and watch the sun sink into the water, and she would think about the life she had left behind. She thought about Alexander, wondering if he had discovered her absence yet, wondering what he had told the kingdom, wondering if he felt any of the grief she had carried with her every mile of her journey. Mostly, though, she thought about herself, about the woman she was becoming in this new, smaller life. She had spent 5 years being Queen Elena, gracious and composed, always aware of how her every word and gesture might be interpreted by courtiers and diplomats. Here, as Nora the scribe, she was simply a woman who worked hard, ate simple meals, and slept in a narrow bed above a bakery that smelled of fresh bread every morning. She told herself this was enough. She told herself she could build a life here, quiet and anonymous, far from the pain of what she had left behind. But some nights, lying awake and listening to the distant sound of waves, she wondered how long that peace could truly last, and what would happen if the past she had run from ever found its way to her door. Alexander Thorne knew something was wrong the moment he woke and found the bed beside him empty and cold, as though Elena had been gone for hours rather than minutes. He sat up quickly, scanning the room, telling himself she had simply risen early, perhaps gone for a walk in the gardens as she sometimes did when sleep would not come easily. But then his eyes fell on the pillow where her head usually rested, and he saw the heavy gold ring resting there, the sapphire catching the morning light in a way that made his stomach drop. He was out of bed and calling for Clara before he had even finished processing what he was seeing. The young maid arrived within minutes, her face already pale, and when Alexander asked where the queen had gone, Clara could only shake her head and admit she had not seen Elena since the previous evening. What followed was a blur of shouting orders, guards searching every corridor of the castle. Servants questioned one by one about the queen's movements over the past several days. Nothing turned up any sign of her within the castle walls. Her chambers were untouched except for the missing ring and a few items of plain clothing that no one had thought to notice were gone, until someone finally checked her wardrobe carefully. Alexander stood in the center of their shared chambers, holding the ring in his shaking hand, and felt something inside him crack open. He did not yet understand why she had left. He only understood, with a certainty that terrified him, that she had left deliberately, planned and prepared, and that meant she had known something, or suspected something, long before this morning. He summoned Edmund Castellan immediately, and the moment the older man entered the room, Alexander saw something flicker across his advisor's face that confirmed his worst fear. "You knew," Alexander said, his voice dangerously low. "You knew something before this morning. Tell me now." Castellan hesitated only briefly before answering. 2 nights ago, one of the kitchen staff mentioned the Queen had asked unusual questions about the healer Margaret's schedule. I did not think it significant at the time. "You did not think it significant," Alexander repeated, his voice rising now, echoing off the stone walls. My wife has disappeared, and you did not think it significant that she was asking questions about the very person caring for Marisol. The room fell silent. Alexander turned away, pressing his hands against his eyes, trying to force his mind to work through the panic clouding it. If Elena had been asking about Margaret's schedule, if she had somehow learned about the hidden wing, about Marisol, about everything Castellan had assured him would remain safely secret for 2 more months, then her departure was not confusion or grief over some smaller matter. It was a direct response to discovering the greatest betrayal of her life. He thought back over the past weeks, searching his memory for any sign he might have missed. The distant look in her eyes during their conversation by the window. Her insistence that she was only tired, over and over, when he had asked if something troubled her. He had noticed the change in her, had even asked about it, and she had lied to his face with such practiced calm that he had believed her without question. Guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had spent the past several months telling himself that keeping the truth from Elena was a temporary necessity, a burden he carried for the good of the kingdom, always with the intention of telling her himself, in his own words, when the time was right. He had allowed Castellan to convince him that waiting was wise. Now, standing in the wreckage of her sudden absence, he understood with terrible clarity that there had never been a good time to keep such a truth from the woman he loved, and that his own cowardice in avoiding the conversation had cost him everything. "We need to find her," Alexander said, his voice regaining some of its strength, hardening into the tone of a king rather than a grieving husband. "Every guard, every rider, every resource this kingdom has, I want her found, and I want her found quickly, before something happens to her, out there alone." Castellan opened his mouth as though to object, perhaps to suggest that a widespread search would draw unwanted attention to the very secret they had worked so hard to protect. But something in Alexander's expression made him close his mouth again without speaking. "And you," Alexander continued, turning to face his advisor fully, "will tell me everything, every detail of this arrangement, from the very beginning. I want to know exactly what you convinced me to agree to, and exactly what role you have played in bringing us to this moment." Over the following hour, in a conversation that left Alexander feeling sick with a combination of anger and shame, Castellan laid out the full history of the arrangement he had orchestrated. He explained how, 5 years into the marriage with no heir in sight, he had begun quietly making inquiries about alternative arrangements that other kingdoms had used in similar situations throughout history. He explained how he had found Marisol Hale, a young woman from a minor noble family with distant ties to Castellan's own bloodline, and had arranged for her introduction to the king under circumstances designed to feel natural rather than calculated. Alexander listened, feeling more and more like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by a man he had trusted completely. He had believed, throughout the entire arrangement, that he was making difficult choices for the good of his kingdom, choices that weighed heavily on his conscience, but that he alone had decided to make. Now he understood that Castellan had guided nearly every step of the process, presenting each decision as though it were the only reasonable path forward, always framing Elena's feelings as a secondary concern to the stability of the throne. "Why?" Alexander asked finally, his voice quiet now, exhausted. "Did you never simply tell me the truth about how deeply involved you were in creating this situation?" Castellan's composure slipped, just slightly, for the first time since Alexander had known him. "Because you would not have agreed to it if you understood how carefully it had been planned. You needed to believe it was your own decision, made out of necessity, rather than a scheme I had constructed." The admission hung in the air between them, and Alexander felt the last piece of trust he had held for his most senior advisor crumble away entirely. "Leave," Alexander said quietly. "I need to think, and I cannot do so with you in this room." Castellan left without further argument, and Alexander sat alone in the silence of his study, surrounded by maps of the kingdom that would soon be covered with markings tracking every road, every village, every possible direction his missing wife might have traveled. He thought about Marisol, down the hall in her hidden chamber, unaware yet of the chaos that had erupted through the castle that morning. He thought about the children she carried, children he had allowed himself to want, to plan for, even as he understood how much pain their existence had caused the woman he had married for duty, and come to love with his whole heart. He thought, most of all, about Elena, somewhere out in the wide world beyond the castle walls, alone and hurting because of choices he had made and allowed to be made in his name. Alexander stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the kingdom he ruled, a kingdom that suddenly felt enormous and impossible to search. Every road and village and hidden corner, a place where his wife might be hiding, might be in danger, might be waiting for him to come find her, or might be determined never to be found at all. He made a decision then, standing at that window, that would shape everything that followed. He would not simply send guards and riders to search on his behalf. He would search for her himself, would ride every road and question every innkeeper, would tear apart the comfortable structure of his kingdom's daily business, until he found the woman he had failed so completely. Whatever it cost him, whatever it cost the throne, he intended to find Elena Whitmore and beg her forgiveness for every lie that had brought them to this terrible morning. Within 3 days, every road leading out of the capital had at least one pair of royal riders stationed along it, questioning travelers, innkeepers, and merchants about a woman traveling alone who might have passed through in recent weeks. The council, when they learned of the scale of the search Alexander had ordered, reacted with open alarm. A meeting was called on the 4th day, and Alexander sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by nobles and advisors who had never before dared to challenge him so directly. "Your Majesty," said Lord Pharaoh, an older nobleman known for his caution in all matters of state, "the kingdom cannot afford to have half its guard occupied searching the countryside for the queen, while pressing matters of governance go unattended. Trade negotiations with the eastern territories are already delayed. The harvest tax collection has been disrupted in 3 provinces, because guards who should be overseeing it have been reassigned to your search." Alexander felt his patience thinning with every word. "The queen of this kingdom has disappeared under circumstances that suggest deep personal betrayal, and you are concerned about tax collection." "I am concerned," Pharaoh said carefully, "about the stability of Aldermere. Rumors are already spreading through the capital, Your Majesty. Some say the queen fled a loveless marriage. Some say she has been taken by enemies of the crown. Some, less kindly, suggest she may already be dead, and that her disappearance is being hidden from the public for reasons of state." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had not considered how quickly rumor would fill the space left by silence, and he understood, listening to Pharaoh's list of theories, that the longer Elena remained missing without explanation, the wilder and more dangerous those rumors would become. "Then we will address the rumors honestly," Alexander said. "I will not hide behind vague statements that only invite more speculation. I will tell the kingdom that the queen has left the capital, that her reasons are private, and that I am personally committed to ensuring her safe return." A murmur ran through the room at this proposal. Castellan, seated near the far end of the table, spoke up for the first time since the meeting began. "Your Majesty, such an honest statement risks revealing far more than intended. If the Queen's reasons for leaving become public knowledge, the arrangement with Lady Marisol will no longer remain private." Alexander looked at his former advisor with an expression that made several other council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "That arrangement, Lord Castellan, is the reason my wife is gone. I have spent the past several days questioning every decision that brought us to this point, and I have come to understand that the secrecy you insisted upon has caused far more damage than honesty ever could have. I will not compound that mistake by hiding behind more secrecy now." The council meeting stretched on for hours, arguments rising and falling around questions of what to reveal, what to conceal, how to balance the search for the missing queen against the practical demands of governing a kingdom. By the end of it, Alexander had secured, through sheer force of determination, an agreement that a public statement would be issued, acknowledging the queen's absence, though the full details of Marisol's presence in the castle would remain unaddressed for the moment, a compromise that satisfied no one entirely, but allowed the search to continue with the full resources of the crown behind it. Over the following weeks, Alexander threw himself into the search, with an intensity that surprised even those who had known him his entire life. He rode out personally, accompanied by a small group of trusted guards, visiting villages along the major roads leading away from the capital, showing a small portrait of Elena to innkeepers and market vendors, asking if anyone had seen a woman matching her description. Most encounters yielded nothing. Some innkeepers thought they might have seen someone similar, but descriptions were vague, memories unreliable, and the trail grew colder with each passing day. Alexander began to understand the enormous size of his own kingdom in a way he never had while sitting comfortably in his castle reviewing maps. There were dozens of roads Elena could have taken, hundreds of villages where she might have stopped, countless directions in which a determined woman could disappear if she truly wished not to be found. He also began to understand, through countless conversations with ordinary people along his search, how differently his kingdom looked from outside the castle walls. Villagers spoke to him with a mixture of fear and resentment he had not expected, describing tax burdens that felt crushing, roads that had gone unrepaired for years despite repeated requests, a sense that the crown cared little for the daily struggles of common people so long as taxes were paid and order was maintained. It was a humbling education, riding through his own kingdom in search of his missing wife, and Alexander found himself changing in ways he had not anticipated, becoming more attentive to the concerns of the people he passed, more willing to stop and truly listen, rather than simply performing the role of a benevolent but distant monarch. Back at the castle, in his absence, tensions continued to build. Marisol Hale, now aware that her presence had been discovered by the Queen and was the direct cause of Elena's disappearance, grew increasingly anxious about her own position and the safety of the children she carried. She had been told, when she first agreed to Castellan's arrangement, that she would be protected and cared for, that her role in securing the kingdom's succession would be honored and respected. Now, with the Queen gone and rumors swirling through the capital, she found herself uncertain whether any of those promises would be honored once the full truth became known. Margaret the healer, caring for Marisol through the final months of her pregnancy, watched the young woman's anxiety grow with each passing week, and began to wonder herself whether the arrangement she had participated in had been as straightforward as Castellan had originally presented it. Meanwhile, whispers among the castle staff grew louder, despite Alexander's attempts to control the flow of information. Clara, who had been questioned repeatedly about the Queen's final days before her disappearance, found herself caught between loyalty to Elena and fear of what might happen if she revealed too much about what she had witnessed and overheard in the days before the Queen vanished. It was Clara, in fact, who eventually approached Alexander directly upon his return from one of his search expeditions, nearly a month after Elena's disappearance, with information she had been too frightened to share earlier. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling as she stood before him in his study, "I believe I know something about where the Queen might have gone. Before she disappeared, she asked me once about a coastal town, a place she said she had visited as a child. She asked me if I thought it had changed much in the years since. I did not think anything of it at the time, but afterward, I remembered the name of the town, Brenmore." Alexander felt something shift inside him for the first time in weeks, a flicker of genuine hope cutting through the exhaustion and grief that had settled over him since Elena's disappearance. Brenmore, a coastal town, far from the capital, far from the major roads his search had focused on so heavily. He thanked Clara sincerely, promising her that her loyalty and honesty would not be forgotten, and immediately called for maps of the southern coast to be brought to his study. For the first time since the terrible morning he had found her ring resting on an empty pillow, Alexander Thorne felt as though he finally had a direction to follow, a genuine thread of hope leading toward the woman he had failed so deeply, and he intended to follow it to the very end of the kingdom if that was what it took to find her. Elena had been feeling unwell for nearly 2 weeks before she finally allowed herself to consider the possibility that had been quietly forming at the edge of her thoughts. A possibility so unexpected, it took her longer than it should have to accept it. The tiredness she had attributed to the difficulty of her new life, the long hours at the shipping office, and the physical demands of a life without servants to handle every small task, the sickness in the mornings, she had blamed on unfamiliar food, on the fish that formed such a large part of the local diet in Brenmore, so different from what she had eaten in the castle. It was only when Grace Hollins, the kind baker who rented her the small room above the shop, gently asked if she might be expecting a child, that Elena finally allowed the truth to surface fully in her mind. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed that evening, one hand pressed against her stomach, and felt a wave of emotion so overwhelming she could not immediately identify what she felt. Joy, certainly, A deep and startling joy at the thought that after 5 years of desperate hoping, of physicians and remedies and endless disappointment, she might finally be carrying a child. But beneath the joy ran currents of fear and grief that threatened to pull her under entirely. This child, if the possibility proved true, had been conceived before her discovery of Marisol, before her flight from the castle, before she had cut herself off entirely from the life and the man she had shared for 5 years. She would be raising this child alone, in a small rented room above a bakery, far from any of the resources or protections that had once surrounded her as queen. She thought about returning to the castle, about the child's rightful place as an heir to the throne of Aldermere, about all the practical and political considerations that would come with such a decision. But every time she considered it, she remembered the conversation she had overheard between Alexander and Castellan, remembered the careful, calculated way they had discussed her feelings as an obstacle to be managed. She could not yet imagine returning to that world, could not imagine trusting that her husband's love for her outweighed his advisor's talent for justifying whatever choices served the throne best. She confirmed the pregnancy with a local midwife a week later, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Doris, who asked few questions about Elena's circumstances and simply confirmed what Elena already suspected, estimating that the child would arrive in roughly 5 months. 5 months. Elena did the calculations in her head repeatedly over the following days, trying to understand what her life would look like by the time the child arrived, trying to plan for a future that felt both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. She continued her work at the shipping office, though Peter Ashby, the kind harbor master who employed her, noticed the change in her within weeks, and gently offered to reduce her hours if the work became too difficult as her pregnancy progressed. Elena, touched by his consideration, accepted gratefully, grateful for an employer who treated her with such simple decency, without demanding explanations she was not prepared to give. Grace, too, became an unexpected source of support during those months. The baker had lost her own husband several years earlier and had raised 2 children largely on her own, and she took to checking in on Elena with a warmth that reminded Elena, painfully, of the mother she had left behind in the northern kingdom she had grown up in. "You don't have to tell me your story," Grace said one evening, as the 2 women sat together in the small kitchen behind the bakery, sharing a simple meal of bread and soup. "But if you ever want someone to listen, I'm here. A woman doesn't run this far from home without good reason." Elena felt tears threatening at the kindness in Grace's voice, but she kept her secrets close, telling only a partial truth about a difficult marriage she had left behind, careful never to mention her true name or the kingdom she had once ruled as queen. As the weeks passed and her pregnancy became more visible, Elena found herself thinking more and more about the child she carried, about what kind of life she wanted to build for them. She thought about names, considering both boys' and girls' names, imagining a small version of herself or perhaps of Alexander, growing up in this quiet coastal town, never knowing the weight of a crown or the complications of royal politics. But even as she tried to imagine this simpler future, she could not entirely escape thoughts of the kingdom she had left behind. She wondered about Alexander constantly, wondered whether he had discovered her absence, wondered what explanation he had offered the kingdom, wondered whether Marisol had given birth yet to the children whose existence had shattered Elena's understanding of her marriage. She wondered too whether anyone was searching for her, and if so, how hard they were looking. It was nearly 4 months into her time in Brenmore, her pregnancy now impossible to hide, beneath even the loosest clothing, when the first sign of danger appeared. She was working at her desk in the shipping office one afternoon, recording the arrival of a merchant vessel from the Eastern Territories, when a man entered the office to inquire about cargo fees, a merchant she did not recognize. He glanced at her briefly as he approached the counter, and Elena thought nothing of it until she noticed him staring more intently, his expression shifting from casual interest to something sharper, more focused. "Forgive me," the man said slowly, "but have we met before? You seem very familiar to me." Elena felt her heart begin to race, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, the same composed calm she had spent 5 years perfecting as queen. "I don't believe so. I've lived in Brenmore for some time now." The man continued studying her face for a moment longer, before shaking his head slightly, as though dismissing whatever thought had crossed his mind. "My apologies. You simply remind me of someone I once saw, years ago, at a royal function in the capital. A trick of the light, perhaps. He completed his business and left the office, but Elena sat frozen at her desk for several minutes after he departed, her hands trembling slightly as she processed how close that encounter had come to unraveling everything she had built in Brynmore. That evening, she walked home along the harbor more quickly than usual, glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, feeling for the first time in months the old fear she had carried during her journey from the capital, the fear of discovery, of being dragged back into a life she had chosen to leave behind. She said nothing to Grace or Peter about the encounter, not wanting to raise questions she could not answer, but the incident lodged itself in her mind as a warning. Brynmore might feel like a safe, quiet corner of the world, but she was still, ultimately, the queen of a kingdom that had likely spent months searching for her. Her face, though less recognizable in a coastal town far from the capital, was not entirely unknown. As her pregnancy progressed further, Elena began to think seriously, for the first time, about what she truly wanted for the future. She could continue living quietly in Brynmore, raising her child alone, always watching over her shoulder for the moment someone else might recognize her and report her location back to the capital. Or she could consider, however painful the thought remained, what it might mean to eventually face Alexander again, to demand the truth and the accountability she deserved, and to decide from a position of strength and clarity what role, if any, he and the kingdom of Aldermere would play in her child's life. She had not yet made her decision when, less than a week after the merchant's unsettling recognition, a stranger arrived in Brynmore, asking pointed questions at the local inn about a woman who might have traveled to the coast from the capital many months earlier. Back in the capital, weeks before the stranger's arrival in Brynmore, Alexander sat in his study poring over documents that Edmund Castellan had reluctantly handed over, following a direct order from the king, documents relating to the arrangement with Marisol Hale that Alexander had never been permitted to see in full detail. He had expected, when he began this review, to find confirmation of what Castellan had already admitted, a carefully constructed plan to secure the succession through an alternative arrangement when it appeared Elena could not conceive. What he found instead, buried within financial records and correspondence spanning nearly 2 years, was something far more troubling. The documents revealed that Marisol Hale was not simply a distant relative selected for convenience, as Castellan had originally claimed. She was, in fact, a much closer relation than he had disclosed, the daughter of Castellan's own younger sister, making any children she bore not simply heirs to Alexander's throne, but children who carried Castellan's own bloodline directly into the line of succession. Alexander read through the papers with growing horror, understanding piece by piece the true scope of what his most trusted advisor had orchestrated. Castellan had not simply been solving a succession crisis out of loyalty to the crown. He had been engineering a situation that would place his own family's bloodline on the throne of Aldermere, using Alexander's genuine anguish over the lack of an heir as an opportunity to advance his family's influence for generations to come. The correspondence included letters between Castellan and Marisol's mother, discussing arrangements for the girl's education and preparation for what was referred to, with chilling casualness, as her role in securing the family's future. There were financial records showing payments made to Marisol's family well before she had ever been introduced to Alexander, payments that made clear this had never been a spontaneous arrangement born of desperate circumstances, but a plan set in motion long before Alexander had even fully accepted that Elena might never conceive. Alexander sat back in his chair, the papers trembling slightly in his hands, feeling a rage build within him, unlike anything he had experienced in years of careful, measured rule. He had trusted Castellan completely, had allowed the man to guide countless decisions throughout his reign, had believed every justification offered for the secrecy surrounding Marisol's presence in the castle. And throughout all of it, he had been nothing more than a piece in a much larger scheme, manipulated by a man who had used Alexander's love for his kingdom and his private grief over the succession as tools to advance his own family's power. He called for the captain of the royal guard immediately, a stern, loyal man named Owen Barrett, who had served the crown for over 20 years and had grown increasingly uneasy over the past months about the direction the kingdom seemed to be heading. "I want Lord Castellan arrested," Alexander said, his voice hard and final. "Confined to his chambers under guard until I have decided how to proceed. He is not to leave the castle, not to send or receive any correspondence, and not to speak with anyone without my express permission." Owen did not question the order, though his eyebrows rose slightly at the gravity in the king's voice. "It will be done, Your Majesty." The arrest, when it happened later that evening, caused an immediate stir throughout the castle. Castellan, caught entirely off guard by guards arriving at his chambers, protested loudly, demanding to know what crime he had supposedly committed, insisting that everything he had done had been in service to the stability of the throne. Alexander, informed of the protests, went to Castellan's chambers himself, standing in the doorway, while guards flanked the older man who had once been his closest advisor. "You told me this arrangement was necessary for the kingdom," Alexander said, his voice carrying a coldness that silenced whatever further protest Castellan had been preparing. "You never told me it was equally necessary for your own family's ambitions. You built an entire scheme on my private grief and called it loyalty to the crown." Castellan's face went pale, understanding immediately that Alexander had discovered the full truth buried within the documents he had been forced to hand over. "Your Majesty, whatever benefit my family might have gained does not change the fact that the kingdom genuinely needed an heir. My intentions were not entirely self-serving." "Perhaps not entirely," Alexander said, "but enough that you concealed the truth of Marisol's family connection to you, enough that you built payments and arrangements with her family before ever presenting the situation to me as a desperate necessity rather than a choice you had already engineered. You will remain confined here while I decide what justice looks like for what you have done, not only to me, but to my wife, who fled this castle because of the world you built behind her back." He left Castellan's chambers without waiting for further response, the guards sealing the door behind him, and made his way back to his own study, where he sat for a long time in silence, processing the full weight of the betrayal he had uncovered. Over the following days, Alexander worked to untangle the full scope of the conspiracy, questioning Marisol directly for the first time since Elena's disappearance, approaching the conversation with a gentleness he had not expected to feel, given everything he had learned. Marisol, when confronted with the documents revealing her family connection to Castellan, broke down in tears, admitting that she had known, on some level, that her uncle's involvement in arranging her presence at the castle was more calculated than the romantic story she had been encouraged to believe about herself and the king. She had genuinely come to care for Alexander during their time together, she insisted, and had never intended to cause the queen such pain, but she had also been young and eager to please a family that had raised her with constant reminders of the importance of securing the connection Castellan had spent years building. "I did not know the full truth of what he was planning," Marisol said, wiping tears from her face as she sat across from Alexander in a quiet sitting room, her pregnancy now well advanced. "I believed, truly believed, that this was about the kingdom's need for an heir, and that my role in providing that was a genuine service, not a scheme to place my family on the throne through deception." Alexander studied her for a long moment, seeing in her genuine distress the same kind of manipulation he himself had experienced at Castellan's hands, both of them used as pieces in a plan neither had fully understood. "I believe you did not know the full extent of it," Alexander said finally. "But the children you carry are still my children, regardless of the circumstances that brought us together. I intend to ensure they are cared for and protected, though they will not inherit the throne through the deception their existence was born from. That inheritance belongs to whatever children I have with my wife, should she ever choose to return to me." Marisol nodded, understanding and accepting the boundary Alexander was drawing, relief evident in her expression that she and her children would not simply be discarded, despite the collapse of Castellan's scheme. With Castellan's conspiracy fully exposed and the immediate danger of his manipulation contained, Alexander turned his full attention back to the search for Elena, now armed with the knowledge Clara had provided about the coastal town of Brenmore, and a renewed determination to find his wife, and finally offer her the complete, honest truth she deserved, free from any of the manipulation and secrecy that had poisoned their marriage for far too long. He dispatched his most trusted rider, a quiet, capable man named Daniel Corwin, ahead to Brenmore to make careful, discreet inquiries, while Alexander himself prepared to follow within days, determined this time to complete the journey himself, rather than relying solely on others to bring his wife home. Elena heard about the stranger asking questions before she ever saw him herself, the news reaching her through Grace, who had heard it from a neighbor who worked at the inn where the man had taken a room. "He's asking about a woman who might have arrived here many months ago," Grace said, concern evident in her voice, as she relayed the information to Elena one evening in the small kitchen behind the bakery. "Someone traveling alone, from the direction of the capital. He's showing people a small painted portrait, though no one at the inn seemed to recognize the face." Elena felt her whole body go cold at the description. A portrait. Someone was searching for her specifically, carrying an image of her face from door to door, asking the very questions that could unravel the quiet life she had built over the past several months. She spent that entire night awake, torn between two impossible choices. She could flee again, disappear from Brenmore before the stranger's search brought him close enough to recognize her, starting over somewhere new with her pregnancy now far too advanced to make such a journey easily or safely, or she could stay, risk discovery, and finally face whatever consequences awaited her from the life she had left behind. The physical reality of her pregnancy made the decision more complicated than it might have been months earlier. She was due to give birth within weeks, her body no longer capable of the long, difficult travel that had brought her from the capital to Brenmore in the first place. Fleeing now would mean risking her own health and the health of her unborn child, a risk she was not certain she was willing to take, simply to avoid a confrontation she had, in some quiet corner of her heart, always known might eventually arrive. She decided, after that long, sleepless night, that she would not run. If the stranger's search led him to her, she would face him, and through him, whatever message or demand he carried from the capital. 2 days later, she saw him for herself. She was walking home from the shipping office in the late afternoon when she noticed a man standing near the harbor, speaking with Peter Ashby outside the office she had just left. The man was tall, dressed in traveling clothes that marked him as someone who had journeyed a considerable distance, and something in his careful, deliberate manner made Elena's instincts immediately identify him as the stranger Grace had described. She considered turning back, taking a different path home to avoid passing near him, but before she could decide, Peter glanced up and noticed her, and something in his expression, a flicker of concern crossing his usually calm features, told her he had already connected her to whatever the stranger was seeking. She had no choice but to continue walking, and as she approached, the stranger turned to look at her directly, his eyes widening slightly with a recognition he seemed to be fighting to control. "Forgive my directness," he said, his voice careful and measured, "but might I trouble you for a moment of your time?" Elena studied his face, searching for any recognition of her own, and found none. She had never seen this man before, which meant he was not someone from the court who might recognize her personally, but rather someone sent specifically to search, carrying only a portrait to guide his identification. "I don't believe we've met," Elena said, keeping her voice steady, the same careful composure she had relied on throughout every difficult moment of the past several months. "No," the man agreed. "We have not. My name is Daniel Corwin, and I've traveled a great distance searching for someone. I wonder if you might allow me to ask you a question that may seem unusual." Elena's heart pounded, but she nodded, unable to think of a reasonable way to refuse without drawing even more suspicion. Daniel reached into a small leather bag he carried and withdrew a folded piece of paper, opening it carefully to reveal a small painted portrait, faded slightly from travel, but still clearly recognizable. Elena looked at her own face, staring back at her from the portrait, painted during the early years of her marriage, before the weight of the past year had changed something in her eyes that the artist could never have captured. "I've been asked to find this woman," Daniel said quietly, watching Elena's face carefully as he spoke. "She is very important to someone who has been searching for her for many months, someone who deeply regrets the circumstances that led to her leaving, and who wishes only to speak with her, to offer explanations and apologies she was never given the chance to hear before she disappeared." Elena felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, the careful composure she had maintained for so many months finally beginning to crack under the weight of being seen, truly seen. for the first time since she had fled the capital. "Who sent you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer with absolute certainty. "The king himself," Daniel said gently. "He has searched every road, every village, for nearly 6 months. He learned of Brenmore only recently, from information provided by a young servant who remembered a conversation with the queen before her disappearance. He asked me to come ahead, to search carefully and discreetly, and to send word immediately if I found any sign of her." Elena stood silently for a long moment, one hand resting instinctively over her rounded stomach, weighing everything Daniel had said against everything she had experienced during her months of quiet exile in Brenmore. "And if I told you," she said slowly, "that I have no interest in returning to the life I left behind, what would you do?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I would respect your wishes and report to the king that I found no trace of the queen, though it would pain me to lie to a man who has searched so tirelessly and with such genuine regret. But I do not believe, having found you standing here before me, that you truly wish for him to simply give up his search and never learn what became of you." Elena felt the truth of his words settle over her, understanding that whatever anger and hurt she still carried, she had never truly wanted Alexander to simply lose her forever, had perhaps always known, in some quiet part of herself, that this moment of confrontation would eventually arrive, and that she needed it as much as he apparently did. "Tell him," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the tears now falling freely down her face, "that he may come to Brenmore himself, if he wishes to speak with me. Tell him I will not return to the capital simply because he asks it. But I am willing to hear whatever explanation he wishes to offer, in person, on my own terms, in my own time." Daniel nodded solemnly, folding the portrait carefully and returning it to his bag. "I will send word to him immediately. Knowing him as I do, I suspect he will not delay in coming himself." He was right. Within a week, word reached Brenmore that the King of Aldermere himself had departed the capital, traveling south toward the coast, determined to find his missing queen and, at long last, offer her the truth and the accountability she had been denied for so many months. Elena spent that week in a state of nervous anticipation unlike anything she had experienced since her flight from the castle, torn between dread and a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, preparing herself, as best she could with her pregnancy now nearing its final weeks, for the confrontation that was finally, after so much distance and pain, about to arrive at her door. Alexander arrived in Brenmore on a gray morning, the sky heavy with clouds threatening rain, and he felt his heart pounding harder than it had during any council meeting or diplomatic negotiation of his entire reign. He had traveled the final stretch alone, leaving his small escort of guards at the edge of town, understanding instinctively that Elena would not want to see him arrive surrounded by soldiers and royal ceremony, as though he had come to reclaim property rather than to seek forgiveness from the woman he loved. Daniel had given him careful directions to the bakery where Elena was staying, and Alexander walked the narrow streets of the coastal town on foot, drawing curious glances from locals who had never seen someone dressed quite so finely walking through their quiet streets. He barely noticed them, his entire focus fixed on the small building ahead, its windows warm with lamplight against the gray morning outside. He found her standing in the small garden behind the bakery, tending to a modest collection of herbs Grace had helped her plant months earlier, her pregnancy now unmistakable beneath a simple woolen shawl wrapped against the coastal chill. Alexander stopped several feet away, unable for a moment to make himself move any closer, simply looking at her, this woman he had searched for across half the kingdom, standing here in a stranger's garden, more beautiful and more distant than he had ever imagined possible. Elena turned and saw him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of 6 months of separation and betrayal hanging heavy in the space between them. "You came," she said finally, her voice carrying neither warmth nor coldness, simply a quiet acknowledgement of the reality standing before her. "I would have come sooner," Alexander said, "if I had known sooner where to look. I have searched every road in this kingdom, Elena. I want you to know that, whatever else you believe about me now." "I believe you searched," Elena said. "I never doubted that you would search, once you understood I was truly gone. What I do not know is whether you understand why I left, or whether you have simply come to bring me back because a missing queen is inconvenient for the stability of your throne." The words landed like a blow, and Alexander flinched visibly, understanding the depth of hurt and distrust that had built within her during their months apart. "I know why you left," he said quietly. "I found the hidden wing empty of secrets the day after you disappeared, when I finally forced Castellan to tell me everything. I know you overheard something, though I do not know exactly what, that revealed the truth about Marisol and the children she carries. I know that truth, learned in secret rather than told to you honestly by me, must have felt like the deepest possible betrayal." Elena's composure wavered slightly at the mention of the children, and Alexander noticed, for the first time, how visibly pregnant she herself had become. "There is something you should know," Elena said slowly, one hand moving instinctively to rest over her rounded stomach. "I am carrying a child as well, conceived before I discovered the truth about Marisol, before any of this began. I have carried this child alone, in a stranger's town, wondering the entire time whether I would ever tell you, or whether I would simply raise this child myself, far from the world of secrets and manipulation I left behind." Alexander felt the news hit him with a force that nearly buckled his knees, joy and grief and shock all colliding within him at once. A child, his child, carried alone by the wife he had failed so completely, hidden from him, not out of deception, but out of genuine uncertainty about whether he deserved to know. "Elena," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I am so sorry, for all of it. For allowing Castellan to convince me that secrecy was necessary, for not telling you the truth the moment I first agreed to the arrangement with Marisol, for every day I let you believe our shared grief over your inability to conceive was honest, when I was quietly building a life apart from you that I never had the courage to reveal." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the calculation she had heard in his voice through that study door so many months ago, any hint that his apology was simply another careful performance, designed to secure what he needed from her. She found instead only exhaustion and grief, and what appeared to be genuine remorse, the same rawness she remembered from their earliest years together, before the careful masks of royal duty had settled so completely over both of them. "Castellan has been arrested," Alexander continued, when she did not immediately respond. "I discovered documents proving his arrangement with Marisol was never simply about securing the succession. He engineered the entire situation to place his own family's bloodline on the throne, using my grief over our childlessness as a tool to manipulate me into agreeing to something I would never have accepted if I had understood his true motives from the beginning." He explained, in careful detail, everything he had uncovered about the conspiracy, about Marisol's true relationship to Castellan, about the payments and arrangements that had been set in motion long before Alexander had ever been presented with the situation as an unavoidable necessity. He told her about his conversation with Marisol, about his decision that her children, though his own by blood, would not inherit the throne through the deception their existence had been born from, but would still be cared for and protected, free from Castellan's influence. Elena listened to all of it in silence, feeling the pieces of the story she had only partially understood, finally settling into a complete picture. She had known from the conversation she overheard that Castellan had played some role in creating the arrangement, but she had not understood the full depth of his manipulation, had not realized that Alexander himself had been as thoroughly deceived, in his own way, as she had been. "I still do not know," she said finally, "whether I can simply return to the life we had before. Too much has changed. I have changed. Living here these past months, working for my own living, making my own decisions without the weight of a crown determining every choice available to me. I am not certain I can simply become Queen Elena again, as though none of this happened." "I am not asking you to become exactly who you were before," Alexander said. "I am asking for the chance to build something new with you, something honest, built on truth rather than careful management and secrecy. I do not expect you to trust me easily, or quickly. I only ask for the chance to earn that trust back, in whatever way and whatever time that requires." The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, soft and steady, and Elena stood in the small garden, her hand still resting over the child she carried, looking at the man who had once been nearly a stranger to her before becoming, over years of careful, patient love, the person she had trusted more than anyone in the world. She did not offer him forgiveness that morning, not fully, not yet, but she did not send him away either. "Come inside," she said finally. "Grace will want to know why a king is standing in her garden in the rain. And I think, before anything else is decided, we owe each other a much longer conversation than we can have standing out here." Alexander followed her inside, into the warm, simple kitchen behind the bakery, and for the first time in 6 months, felt something like hope begin to settle over the enormous weight of guilt and fear he had carried throughout his long search for the woman he loved. The conversation that followed lasted through the entire afternoon, and well into the evening, Grace tactfully leaving the kitchen to give the king and his missing queen the privacy such a reunion demanded, though she kept a pot of tea steadily refilled between them as the hours passed. Elena asked every question she had carried with her through 6 months of exile, and Alexander answered each one with a directness he had never before allowed himself in matters concerning the crown. He told her about the 2 months Castellan had originally insisted upon, the plan to wait until after Marisol's children were born before revealing anything to Elena, a plan Alexander now understood, with painful clarity, would have caused her even deeper harm than the truth she had discovered on her own. He told her about the search, about the villages he had ridden through, about the ordinary people whose struggles had opened his eyes to failures in his own governance he had never fully recognized, while safely removed within castle walls. He told her about Castellan's arrest, about the difficult decisions still ahead regarding what justice would look like for a man who had manipulated not only the king and queen, but an innocent young woman and the children she now carried. Elena, in turn, told him about her journey to Brenmore, about the fear and the danger, and the unexpected kindness of strangers like Grace and Peter, who had helped her build a new life without ever knowing her true identity. She told him about her work at the shipping office, about the strange freedom of being simply Nora, a scribe with no royal duties, no courtiers watching her every move, no expectations beyond doing her work well and living an honest, quiet life. She told him, finally, about discovering her own pregnancy, about the fear of raising a child entirely alone, about the moments of doubt when she wondered whether she had made the right choice in leaving without ever confronting him directly, wondered whether a braver version of herself might have stayed and fought for the truth rather than simply disappearing into the night. "I do not think you made the wrong choice," Alexander said, when she voiced this doubt aloud. "I think, had you stayed and confronted me directly, Castellan would have found some way to manage the situation, to convince us both that patience and secrecy remained the wisest path forward. Your leaving is what finally forced the truth into the open, what finally made me understand how deeply his manipulation had shaped decisions I believed were entirely my own." By the time evening settled over Brenmore, something had shifted between them, not full forgiveness, not yet, but a foundation of honesty neither of them had experienced in their marriage for a very long time. Elena agreed, cautiously, to consider returning to the capital, though she made clear that any return would come with conditions, changes she needed to see not only in their marriage, but in the governance of the kingdom itself. Over the following weeks, as Elena's pregnancy reached its final stages, Alexander remained in Brenmore, rather than returning immediately to the capital, unwilling to leave her side again after so many months apart. He wrote regularly to his council, managing the kingdom's affairs as best he could from a distance, while also beginning the difficult work of determining what consequences Castellan would face for his manipulation, and what protections needed to be established to ensure no future advisor could ever again wield such dangerous influence over decisions of succession and marriage. Elena gave birth to a daughter on a clear morning in early spring, in the same small room above the bakery where she had spent so many months building her quiet, hidden life. Alexander was present for the birth, holding Elena's hand throughout hours of labor with a devotion that finally, gradually, began to rebuild some of the trust that had been so completely shattered months earlier. They named the child Lily, a name with no royal significance, chosen simply because Elena had always loved the flowers that grew wild along the coastal cliffs near Brenmore, a small piece of the ordinary life she had built there, that she wanted to carry forward into whatever future awaited them. The return to the capital, when it finally happened several weeks later, was nothing like Elena's departure. She traveled openly this time, not hidden beneath a plain cloak, but seated beside Alexander in a royal carriage, their newborn daughter cradled in her arms, guards riding alongside rather than searching desperately for any sign of her. The kingdom, informed gradually of the truth behind the queen's absence, through careful, honest statements Alexander insisted upon issuing, despite the discomfort this caused among more traditional members of the council, greeted her return with a mixture of curiosity and genuine relief. Rumors that had spread wildly during her absence began to settle into a more accurate, if still incomplete, understanding of what had happened. A story of betrayal and manipulation that ultimately ended not in tragedy, but in a difficult, hard-won reconciliation. Castellan's trial, held publicly rather than hidden away as he had likely hoped, revealed the full extent of his conspiracy to the kingdom's nobility, resulting in his permanent removal from any position of influence and the confiscation of much of his family's wealth and lands, a punishment Alexander insisted upon not out of vengeance, but as a clear message that no advisor, however trusted, would ever again be permitted to manipulate the crown's most personal and consequential decisions for their own family's benefit. Marisol Hale, freed from her uncle's manipulation and given a genuine choice in her future, for the first time since Castellan had first approached her family years earlier, chose to leave the capital with her twin children, a modest but comfortable estate arranged for her in a distant province, where she could raise them away from the complications and scrutiny of court life. Alexander ensured they wanted for nothing, visiting periodically to see his children grow, while Elena, in a gesture that surprised many at court, eventually extended a cautious, careful kindness toward Marisol, recognizing in her own way that the young woman had also been a victim of Castellan's careful, patient scheming. Elena's return to her role as queen came with the changes she had insisted upon during those long conversations in Brenmore. She established new protections for women whose lives might be affected by decisions of succession and inheritance, ensuring no future queen or potential mother of an heir could be so easily manipulated or discarded by advisors seeking to serve their own interests rather than genuine justice. She pushed for greater transparency in the council's dealings, insisting that major decisions affecting the royal family be documented clearly rather than negotiated in secret, hidden hallways and locked rooms. Her marriage to Alexander, in the months and years that followed, was never quite what it had been before her discovery of Marisol's hidden chamber. Something had been broken that could not be entirely repaired, a certain innocent trust that had existed in their earliest years together, before either of them had fully understood how vulnerable love could be to manipulation by those who claimed to serve the greater good. But what replaced that lost innocence was something Elena came to value even more deeply, a marriage built on hard-won honesty, on the understanding that both of them had made mistakes, had been manipulated in different ways by a man who had nearly destroyed everything they had built together. They spoke more openly now, questioned each other more directly, refused to let comfortable silence stand in for the difficult conversations that honest partnership required. Lily grew up hearing, when she was old enough to understand, a careful, age-appropriate version of the story of how her parents had nearly lost each other entirely, a story her mother told, not as a fairy tale with a simple happy ending, but as an honest account of how love, tested by betrayal and rebuilt through hard, deliberate effort, could become something stronger and more genuine than it had ever been before. Elena Whitmore, once a queen who fled her own kingdom rather than face a lie she could not yet understand, became known throughout Aldermere not simply as the wife who had returned, but as the woman whose courage in leaving and whose strength in eventually choosing to return on her own terms had reshaped the kingdom's understanding of what honesty and accountability truly required, even from those who sat upon its highest thrones.